Fight on, Trojans, and welcome to the Voice of College Football USC channel. I'm your host, Rick Anaya. You can find me on Twitter at LBC Trojan. Glad to share with you some new content, a weekly video we're calling Trojans Talk on Tap, where I'll keep your glass full with the latest buzz on USC football, sometimes an opinion on the ever-changing landscape that's college football, and always a quality craft beer recommend so you can be an MVP of your next tailgate. And speaking of tailgates, Trojans, less than 3 weeks until the kickoff of the 2023 season against San Jose State, Saturday, August 26, 5 p.m. at the Coliseum. Hope to see you there. So what is this weekly segment? What are we going to be talking about? How can we not talk about what went down last Friday, which essentially is Black Friday in the Pac-12, where 5 schools joined Colorado, which 1 week earlier left the Pac-12 conference. So all in all, we found out on Friday that Colorado, Arizona State, and Utah announced that they will be leaving to the Big 12, and then Washington and Oregon will be joining USC and UCLA in the Big 10 starting in 2024. Why did this happen? How did it happen? It's starting to come out now, some great articles to read. Stuart Mandel in The Athletic kind of details what was happening from the offer that the Pac-12 presidents were waiting for 13 months. The first offer that came out on Tuesday, August 1st, detailing what happened during the week and what ultimately happened Friday morning. And then there's also Sports Business Journal, John Oran. You want to take a look at some of the articles he's written, very knowledgeable. So why are we going to talk about this? Well, Trojans, you may have been experiencing this online or out and about the last year, rocking your USC gear, and somebody will come up to you, hey, screw you, USC. Thanks a lot for ruining the Pac-12. Well, that couldn't be farther from the truth. And what I'm hoping to share today is my viewpoint. Take a few points, if you will, so you can go ahead and preach the truth. And it all started, there's four parties that, in my opinion, are responsible for the Pac-12 ultimately dissolving on Black Friday, essentially, with only leaving 4 schools left: Washington State, Oregon State, Stanford, and Cal. And those 4 parties that are responsible are Larry Scott, ASU President Michael Crow, George Kliavkoff, the current commissioner of the Pac-12, and then lastly, the Pac-12 leadership, the Pac-12 presidents that let this happen ultimately on their watch. Now, why these 4? What happened? There's numerous events that led up to the demise of the Pac-12. And USC and UCLA, when they announced that they were leaving back on June 30th, 2022, was very significant. Why? Well, that was the last day of the academic year, and if they would have announced a day later, they would have been charged an exit fee. But there was a lot of events that led up to that. And if you go back to when Larry Scott was hired, he was hired to be the Pac-12 commissioner in 2009, but really it was his first media rights deal, and that's what he was hired to do, is to sign a media rights deal on behalf of the Pac-12. And he did that in May of 2011. But leading up to that, if you'll remember, USC was officially put on sanctions by the NCAA in June of 2010. The following month, Max Nikias became the president of USC in July of 2010. And at that time, the leadership at USC was questionable. It wasn't what it is today. Max Nikias was great at fundraising, but he was challenged at basically everything else. And the athletic department was not the athletic department that we have today. We had ADs that were former USC football players, and one of those ADs, Lynn Swan, actually extended Clay Helton for an additional 5 years. And speaking of extensions, we'll talk about Larry Scott extension and who was behind that and why that happened. But Larry Scott's deal was a home run at first. It was 12 years, $3 billion with ESPN and Fox. And just to let you know, the last year of the previous Pac-10's media rights deal, which was in 2011, was a total of $60 million for that last year divided by 10 schools. So it was $6 million. And why I'm telling you that is because there was a key part of the formation of the Pac-12, adding Colorado and adding Utah. You had Larry Scott who was a Harvard grad. He was the president of the Women's Tennis Association. He had no college athletic experience, any team college athletic experience. And he structured the deal that also created the 100% ownership of a Pac-12 network. The Pac-12 was going to deliver their own network. And at the time, other conferences had networks, but that were owned partially by other entities. For instance, in 2007, the Big Ten Network, very successful, was 49% owned by Fox. And Fox's parent company was News Corp, and News Corp owned DirecTV. So there was seamless distribution, and it was very successful for the Big Ten. Pac-12 was doing it differently. They, into assuming all the costs associated with owning a network, they would go ahead and benefit from all the revenue that was generated, profits, and then ultimately a sale. And so that was key into convincing, which USC and UCLA did not want to do, because under the previous agreements, USC and UCLA being in the LA markets and the brand equity that they built in their basketball and football programs with national championships, they had unequal revenue sharing. And so they were convinced, and they agreed to finally, for equal revenue sharing. Didn't seem important at the time to the other 10 schools, not named SC and UCLA, but it was very important to USC and UCLA because honestly, they're a lot different than Corvallis, Oregon, and Pullman, Washington. LA brings the eyeballs, it drives the brand, it drives the Pac-12 and West Coast football. But at the time, a lot, just speculation. Other teams in the conference were tired of USC and UCLA. You had in 2009 Chip Kelly going to Oregon, and Oregon was becoming a successful team. They played and lost, unfortunately, for them to Auburn in the 2010 national championship game. But they were moving up, and they wanted to replace USC as the premier brand on the West Coast. So why is this important? Well, it sets the stage. And so it was estimated at the time that after developing the Pac-12 network and startup costs, in a few years, each team would be earning an additional possibly $10 million in revenue from the wholly owned network, in addition to the $20 to $25 million annually from the TV media rights deal. So as you can see, this was just the 20 to 25 was quadrupling the media rights deal in 2011. So that possibly gave the other teams influence to, hey, USC, UCLA, take equal revenue and get in line. We'll never know. Fast forward in 2017, DirecTV still did not accept the Pac-12 network and its 7 channels. Reasons why? No one really knows. You could say it's just bad business and Larry Scott misread the room. And sometimes academics do that. Academia will do that when you're trying to tell an industry that you know nothing about how to do their business. Just my opinion. Key thing is time kills all deals in business. Remember that phrase, time kills all deals. Well, part of it, he had 7 years, well, roughly 5-6 years from 2012 when the initial deal happened to get distribution, and it did not happen. And teams were getting frustrated because they were not hitting the revenue projections for their athletic departments. Also, part of the deal with ESPN and Fox, ESPN had late night kickoffs that, as you know, Trojans, you could find maybe 7 days in advance that you're going to be a 7:30 game. And the Pac-12 became a hashtag, Pac-12 After Dark. It became a joke. And each year of the Pac-12, with only 2 teams making the college football playoff in that era that started in 2014 and moving forward to today, only Oregon and Washington made the college football playoff. Oregon winning a game against Florida State, then ultimately losing in 2014 to Ohio State. And we all remember, I think it was 2016, Washington got boat raced. Chris Peterson's team losing to Nick Saban. Wasn't even competitive. So that added to the demise of the Pac-12 and the lack of respect that it had outside of each of those towns in Seattle or Oregon, in Eugene. Conferences outside of the Pac-12 didn't give the Pac-12 and any of those teams respect. Even those great Stanford teams, even though they would win Rose Bowls and conference championships, didn't get the respect. So what happened in 2017 is Michael Crow, step in Michael Crow. He's the ASU president, and he enabled Larry Scott, and he was an ally of Larry Scott and convinced the Pac-12 presidents to give him more time. And so they extended him for 5 years. Even though all of the other issues were happening, there was overspending. Larry Scott was making millions of dollars. They were paying a lot more for rent in downtown San Francisco for the Pac-12 offices and TV production facilities, a lot more than any of the other conferences. But that was Champagne Larry. That was his taste. And the Pac-12 presidents enabled Larry Scott, and Michael Crow was there to extend him. Move on to 2018, and there was an opportunity for the Pac-12 to move forward. ESPN had an offer at the end of the year, reportedly, to take over the Pac-12 networks and in exchange for signing a new grant of rights with the Pac-12, extending it sometime into the late 2030s, to believe to be a 20-year deal. And this would eliminate the distribution problem that the Pac-12 had always had with DirecTV. It would improve the relationship with ESPN and perhaps getting some better TV windows in the future. We'll never know because Larry Scott didn't agree to that deal. Why is beyond us, beyond anybody. But perhaps it was only 1 year after getting extended. Larry Scott was known to be very greedy. And so maybe he was thinking, if I do agree to this deal, everything I promised in terms of 100% ownership of the Pac-12 network with profitability and a potential sale would not come to fruition. And maybe he feared for his job and that he would be eliminated. So that is a distinct possibility. Moving forward to the summer of 2019, and USC grew up. Carol Folt was hired in the summer, and later Mike Bone was hired in November of 2019. COVID hit, and all the Pac-12 teams lost a lot of money. The athletic departments lost a ton of money, and there was time to by every school, including USC, to reevaluate, look forward through this pandemic and what their futures were going to be like. And USC made a big move in November of 2021, and that's hiring Lincoln Riley. Hiring Lincoln Riley to an unprecedented $12 million a year, 10-year contract. It was a huge move at the time, and it showed that USC was back, fully aligned from Dr. Carol Folt at the president, to the board of trustees, to the athletic department, to now the head coach. And the rest of the Pac-12 and college football was put on notice. And notice came on June 30th, 2022, when USC mentioned SC and UCLA were going to the Big Ten. So again, time kills all deals. Larry Scott had more than a decade to elevate the Pac-12 and execute his vision of 100% of the Pac-12 network with profitability and eventually a sale. It did not happen, and USC didn't see a clear path out. You could have your equal revenue sharing Pac-12. We were going to get paid, and that's what happened. Another guy that's culpable is ASU President Michael Crow, as I stated. Michael Crow was responsible for extending Larry Scott. He was an ally. If you also remember this guy, he hired Ray Anderson, and he was Herm Edwards' former agent. He hired Ray Anderson to run the ASU athletic department sometime in 2014, 2015. And when they hired Herm Edwards in, I believe, 2017, ASU was coming up with a new athletic model kind of based on the NFL, where the head coach at a CEO level, he would be alleviated from a lot of the duties so he could concentrate on football. This was going to be state of the art. That's Michael Crow trying to think he's the smartest guy and he's going to do it bigger and better than everybody else. Well, we saw what happened, and we're still waiting for NCAA sanctions because ASU was accused of recruiting during COVID, and it came from within. Emails and receipts and pictures were sent by ASU staffers to the NCAA. That shows you how much distrust they had in the ASU athletic department. and how much lack of respect they had for Herm Edwards, Ray Anderson, and Michael Crow. Speaking of Michael Crow, hold his name. So in January of 2021, the Pac-12 decided, hey, we're going to let Larry Scott go. And maybe that was because there was a different vision coming out of COVID, different leadership. And they realized moving forward, they did not want Larry Scott to be heading up the negotiations for the 2024 Pac-12 media rights deal. So they hired George Kliavkoff in the summer of 2021. And stop me if you've heard this before, Trojans. He didn't have any college athletics experience being a commissioner, but he had experience coming from MGM Entertainment. He was involved with Major League Baseball. So this is the guy that the Pac-12 presidents agreed to hire to lead them through the remainder of Larry Scott's term and into finding a partner for the grant of rights that was going to come up in 2024. George Kliavkoff started early in August of 2022 to negotiate those rights. And nothing happened. As you know, there was a 90-day exclusive window with Fox and ESPN, who have the rights right now. They didn't make any type of bid, or if they did, it wasn't to the likings of the Pac-12. Fast forward, Pac-12 media days. Nothing was announced. Nothing was announced prior to that. And there was a sign that something was up because Colorado Athletic Director Rick George walked out of Pac-12 media days before it concluded, which was a bad sign. And that was on the Friday the 21st. And the following Wednesday, Colorado announced that it was going to the Big 12. They have had enough. Again, at that point, it was 12 months, and there was no Pac-12 media deal in front of them to have any type of comfort. Time kills all deals. And then we saw what happened. Read some articles. Finally, the Apple deal was presented on Tuesday, August 1st to the Pac-12 presidents. Initially, it was reported to be $23 million per school. It was countered, and it was at $25 million per school. A little bit less, $6.7 million less than the $31.7 million deal that the Big 12 had signed. So the deal itself, they were led to believe, the other Pac-12 presidents, that there was another deal coming, a linear deal with broadcast partners. Could have been Fox, ESPN, CBS, a number of them, but that didn't happen. And so the Pac-12 presidents on Thursday, there was an Arizona Board of Regents meeting on August the 3rd, as well as in the evening, a Washington Board of Regents meeting. And ASU President Michael Crow, this is what he had to say about the Apple deal. He said that the Apple deal is a technological 23rd century Star Trek thing with really unbelievable capability that ASU was very interested in, unquote. And he also said that we were the stalwarts fighting for the Pac-12 until the last ditch. So this deal had escalators in it, and that based on subscriptions, I believe it was just a little bit more than 2 million subscriptions would get them to the Big 12 $31.7 million threshold. George Kliavkoff challenged the presidents to think bigger. With 5 million subscriptions, you could attain $50 million annually. Well, the Pac-12 presidents on that Thursday night agreed to do a conference call in the morning Friday at 7 a.m. Many thought, and it was being reported, that it looked like the Pac-12 was going to stick together, so much so that the Big 12 reportedly had some concerns that evening. And so they were going to convene at 7 a.m. on Friday, August 3rd. Well, the University of Washington had time to sleep on it. Again, time kills all deals. And when the University of Washington and Oregon didn't show up at 7 a.m., the other three schools realized something was happening. That something was happening. Now, Michael Crow had a vision of this Apple deal, but Anna Marie Cauchi, the president of the University of Washington, had a different perspective. She said the Apple deal was not the deal that we had been discussing just days before. and it was not going to secure our future. Washington President Anne-Marie Cauchi told reporters on Saturday, when you have a deal that people are saying one of the best aspects is that you can get out of it as a league after 2 years, that tells you a lot. Okay? So as you can see, the University of Washington has different motivations, and the University of Arizona and Arizona State had different motivations, just like USC and UCLA. No team, not all teams in the Pac-12 are created equal. And that came to roost because when Colorado left the Big 12 a week earlier, that was officially the Pac-12 Titanic hitting the iceberg. And the other schools, ASU, Arizona, Washington, Arizona State, and Oregon were left scurrying for life rafts. And that's what happened. And so that morning, Friday morning, a decision was made by the University of Washington and Oregon to take a 50% discount, go into the Big 12 with all the extra travel expenses, taking half the fee because it secured their future. According to Dr. Cauchi, it was the best thing for their university, for visibility, having a linear partner, and being able to play in one of the nation's best conferences. And so then Arizona State, kicking and screaming, had to go to the Big 12. And they didn't want to go to the Big 12. But Michael Crow, eat your crow. It's best served cold. Karma, buddy. And then finally, the Pac-12 presidents, hey, you let this happen. You hired Larry Scott. You extended him. And then you hired George Kliavkoff. And for whatever reason, it took you 13 months to get a deal. Some may say that Washington extended this deal because they knew that eventually nothing would happen. And perhaps the Big Ten wanted to throw them a life raft. And so they grabbed Oregon. And maybe if Oregon didn't say yes, they would have taken Stanford. Who knows? But now instead of the Pac-12, it's the 4-pack. And I feel for Washington State and Oregon State and Stanford and Cal. But guess what? You were 4 of the 12 schools that are 4 of the 10 schools that wanted equal revenue sharing. And now you got what you got.
This week's craft beer recommend is from Wild Fields Brewing out of Atascadero, California. It's called Montana de Oro. It's an IPA lager, 6% ABV. This is the perfect tailgating beer. It's crushable for those who enjoy IPAs but don't want to get filled up on them. You get the huge aromatics from a dry hopping of Motica and Mosaic hops. It has a pale Pilsner malt, which gives it some balance. And it finishes with a lager yeast. Very crisp, clean finish, gets you ready for the next one. Cheers and fight on.